there, is he?
No, hit timer.
Okay.
Hi, we are live. Thanks for joining us for TCSTV Live. My name is Dave. I will be your host for tonight's event. It's a book talk with Ted Forbes, Visually Speaking by Ted Forbes. It's a fantastic book. He's one of our favorite guys in the industry. But there is a bunch of people behind the scenes working to make this happen. I'm sorry we started just a couple minutes late. And we have Jeff and Kai, who are manning the scenes behind here, making sure everything goes off without a hitch. But if there is, stay tuned. We'll make sure we try to get it corrected as quickly as we can. Now, what I really like about live streaming is the ability to interact with a huge audience and a really worldwide audience, which is fantastic. So if you have questions, you have a couple ways of doing that. You can either participate in the room and pose a question, and we'll get to as many as we can. Ted loves to talk, so if you've ever met him before, he does love to talk. And so I'm a little worried that we only have an hour for this event. We'll see if it goes a little bit longer. But if you don't want to participate in that, you can certainly email me. It's just dave@thecamerastore.com, and I will get to your comments and questions like that. We'll have some questions at the end, certainly, for sure. So if you're not already familiar with our guest tonight, Ted Forbes is a photographer, filmmaker, and YouTube creator who has achieved international acclaim in his channel. The Art of Photography. It's fantastic. You guys have to check it out. Using his platform to inspire and educate, Forbes has created over 1,000 videos since 2008. I'm going to check those numbers actually later, right? And regularly collaborates with household names such as Leica, Hasselblad, Canon, Nikon, Fujifilm, and Sony. So Ted, welcome to our channel tonight. So happy to have you here.
Happy to be here, Dave. Thank you very much.
I mean, we
For
had you
those who
here.
don't know,
You were,
Dave and I have been colleagues for a long time, so this is actually very fun to get
yeah.
to.
No, I always,
Yeah.
I love
Oh,
these press events when we get to go, and it's been a while since we've gone on one, unfortunately. But it's always a pleasure to see you. I mean, it's great, and to have your book here. You came up to Calgary actually in person like a year ago, and
yeah.
you got to hang out with us here in person and had a couple
Yeah, and
beers. And
I'm kind of bummed we're not in the store tonight because that was a fun event. We hung out for a little while in store and then went around the corner and had beer, and it was awfully fun. So.
that's good. So so tell us about this book. I mean, this book took you like a week and a half, 2 weeks to put together. Like it was just kind
Yeah,
of like
right.
scribbled it together on a
It was
notepad.
it was it was quick, man. It just fell to get now. I got approached by the publisher. Gosh, it was 3 years ago now, and they said, "Well, have you ever thought about doing a book?" And they actually had a bunch of things that they proposed, and I thought, it would be fun to do a book, but I didn't want to do. I mean, believe me, I have a library of books between video, and I'm a huge book nerd, and that's how I learned photography largely. And I didn't, and we were talking about this a little earlier that a lot of technical manuals all kind of are the same thing: f-stops, shutter speeds, and then they go into film. The old ones went into film, and the new ones go into digital. And I didn't want to just do the same book that had been done, so I wanted to come at it from a different perspective of my thinking and philosophy towards photography, which would be a visual language. And so hence the title, Visually Speaking. And so that's where that came from. And I mean, it was a lot of fun to write. I had so much fun. I kind of blocked off a couple months in the summer, August and September, back when it started. And I had no idea what was coming in terms of a book. You have an editor, you've got, and it's constant massaging and constant, we could make this a little better. We could do this. We need more images. We need, and so yeah, so it took probably a good 2 years, and then you get into fun stuff like they send you proofs of color, and they're not correct, and so you're constantly trying to. At one point, they said, "Okay, here's the deal. If you're not happy with this, we need you to proof every picture in the entire book," and they made me print them all out. So I had the roll paper attachment on my printer, and got them all. I mean, and it's interesting because you kind of develop you figure out really quick the modifications that you need to make into the printer to get them to work, and so they're going to create a profile on their end, and so it ended up coming out fine. The black and whites were an issue because when you're on a color press, sometimes they come out purple, but they did a wonderful job on that,
That's
and
the thing. A lot
they're
of people
nice.
don't recognize. I mean, there's several aspects to photography, and not just seeing something you want to take a picture of, but actually capturing the image properly. But how you
Sure.
display it. Am I showing it just on my phone? Am I going onto a computer screen?
Yeah.
And printing is an entirely another art in itself altogether. And there's so many nuances to it that it's really
Yeah.
daunting for a lot of people to get into the printing side of things. So yeah, we've been with some other book publishers who've had to deal with proofing, and how much of a perfectionist do you want to be? What's your comfort level?
Well, and you definitely, I mean, if you're in a production like that, there's no way it's going to be 100% perfect. There's just too many pages and too many images. So you get to a point where though where you're comfortable with it, and you take it from there, and it's fine. But more importantly, I mean, the text was the most important part of that book. And when I came at it, I've taught on my channel, especially in the early days, a lot about composition, and I don't have any formal training in photography. I went to college and I studied music, and at one point, that's what I wanted to do was do film scores. And it's just, I mean, the music industry was changing around the time I got out, and photography had always been something for me. Long story short, I'd started the YouTube channel and all that. But a lot of the ways that I went about it is having been a music major in school. There's music theory, and there's all these structural elements and rules of to how things work and why they work and how you put them together. And there's tonal harmony, and then you can go past that. And I was looking for something similar with photography, and it just wasn't out there with anything visual. You have things that everybody's heard of, like rule of thirds. You've had, structural ideas like that, which, it gets you off being in the center all the time with your compositions. And so I wanted a different way of looking at it. So I took a lot of the musical concepts that I had and put them in there. But with the book, the idea was to treat it like a language. So you learn concepts and you learn how to deal with it. But at the same time, like I'm talking to you right now, and I'm not thinking about subjects and verbs and predicates and participles and adjectives. It's all ingrained in my mind, so I'm just speaking to you, and I know that or at least I hope it's making sense. And even on a macro level, I mean, your tongue's making all these weird things to produce sounds, which is highly abstract, but you and I understand language because it's something we've learned from when we were younger. And then you have accents into that. I'm probably sound horribly Texan, and looking at photography the same way, it's to kind of internalize a lot of conceptual ideas, but then to practice them and learn them until where they're ingrained, and then they're a little bit subconscious, and then you're just producing work. And that's my approach to it.
So
And you see a
photography,
lot of those
yeah, you've been in
comparisons in the
photography for a
book.
long time. So when you're putting together the photos for this book, did you see like a change in your technique and more proficient or more mature as you got through the photos more and more, where you couldn't believe you were
Yeah,
proud of this photo
yeah.
10 years ago? Now you're like, oh man, I would have changed that up a little bit.
Well, that's a very interesting question because it's one thing, and this as a teacher, Dave. It's when it's one thing to describe something and then to come up with the example images, and that actually changes the way you think a little bit too. There's one in there where I'm talking about this idea and this concept where, for most visual artists, if you're a painter or you draw, let's say, it's an additive process. I make one mark, I make the next, I add a wash of color. You continue that process of adding things to a canvas until it's finished. And we don't do that in photography. I mean, we're not drawing anything. The lens and the camera take care of all that. It's all automated. But what photography ends up being, rather than additive, is a subtractive process. So it becomes more about what I'm removing from the image and what I'm leaving out, breaking it down to key elements that you want in the image. And that could be a crop, that could be a composition, all those things. And so for that chapter, when I got to it in the book, the idea kind of came up. It's like, okay, well, at what point are you taking away to where you can't tell what the subject is anymore? And we've got this chair in the living room that I used for the photos in the book. And there's like on the page, there's an example of like 5 shots that are there. And if I start cropping in, you can still tell it's a chair. The composition gets interesting. And there's a point where it's just like you see a piece of wood or a joint, and it's no longer there. So all of a sudden your subject now sort of has it's transcended into a different meaning or a different approach. And abstraction becomes a very wonderful tool, I think, in terms of photography when you look at it like that way. I'm not talking about just blurring an image or using motion blur or whatever, but when you're actually consciously removing things in the picture until you get down to the core of what it is that you're trying to say visually. So
No, it is so true. I mean, when you start looking at a photo, what kind of impact does it have on you, right? Is there an emotional impact?
sure.
Are you trying to show something off? But often it's the simpler the image, the easier it is.
Yeah,
And I mean,
it is.
we have a ton of books behind us, and your bookshelf looks a little sparse back there. I'm a little concerned about your mental
They've
health
all
there.
moved into the front.
But I mean, I've done
No.
like I remember doing a family photo shoot, and I went into this beautiful house, and there was a big bookshelf in the background, and it was quite lovely. And I said, take half that stuff down and put it somewhere else, right? It was
Yeah.
just too cluttered. It was just too much, right? And they didn't even think about it at that point, right? And the more you get into
Right.
photography, the more you see these subtleties and these nuances. And once you've seen something that doesn't work, an element that doesn't work, you can't stop looking at it. So
I mean, that's very true, and it doesn't matter what kind of photography you're doing, really. I mean, it could be weddings, it could be a family shot, it could be, it ends up becoming more about what you're choosing to leave out of the image than what it is that you're including in the image. Is the background distracting? There's all these elements that go into it, and I've always thought that too. I mean, it's when we talk about the minimalist idea of it and the simplicity of it. What is the least amount of information that you can? I mean, it's the same as speaking or writing, right? You get into, and I've never written a book, and so I figured out really quickly you can be overly explanative about things. Is that a word? You can over-explain, and sometimes it's better to just be minimal in your approach to that. And I think effective photographs are like that too. They clearly communicate something, whatever that is, whether it's a family member or a portrait or I mean, even product photography is like that. Shots of cars. They're very infrequently. I mean, you do have shots where they're in context of streets and roads or cities or whatever. But when they do the hero shots with it, have you seen those product things where they like the lighting and I mean this crazy studio stuff and this big cavernous. But they're really going for the minimal thing of trying to show off lines of the car and the design and the color and all that stuff. So
I mean, you've been doing your photography has been evolving and your techniques have been evolving. How are you as a writer? Like, have you always been into writing, or is this something new for you?
Well, I did find that I do enjoy it. There's something about a lot of times, and I think anybody who teaches understands this, it's like all of a sudden, okay, I understand a concept, but I'm about to teach it to somebody, and you do need to, the same thing we're talking about, you narrow it down and distill it down into the important things. And so I did enjoy that a lot. And hopefully it's clear in the book without being verbose and overbearing. But yeah, as a writer, that is an interesting question because I mean I've always admired people who can write, but I mean you're looking at somebody who barely passed English when he was in high school. So, and there is in the back of my mind to the teachers that gave me hell over that. It's like hey, I wrote a book. I wasn't the failure I thought you thought I would be, but it was fun to do. It was. I knew it would be fairly intensive, and I did clear the decks to do it. I didn't produce a lot of videos, and I turned down press trips and things during that time because I really needed to, no pun intended, focus on what was going on. But yeah, to organize what you're thinking about. I mean, the publisher was helpful to a degree on that. They're like, because there's certain like when you write a book, there's deadlines that you have to hit. And first of all, is the overall concept, like what are we doing a book on? Kind of what does it look like, that kind of thing. And the second one is they want the table of contents. So that forces you right there to start putting your thoughts into some kind of logical order that is going to make sense. And then it actually kind of, I mean, it's pretty basic from there out because you're just filling it out and trying to make sure things relate where they do and all that. So,
and was it was fun. Was your direction clear, or did it kind of wane off a little bit here and there, or you're always kind of like focused?
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was clear because, and it was just kind of the way that it was conceived about because it was come up with the concept first, which was going to be visually speaking, and I felt confident that I would not have a standard technical manual at the end if I went that direction. And I also wanted, well, the other objective that I had with it is I wanted it to be a book that it didn't matter whether you were a beginner or somebody more advanced. It was just kind of a different way of thinking about this visual content of what we're dealing with as photographers. I mean, so many people, it's like, I remember when I was beginning and you don't know what to shoot. You like the camera, you like the whole process of it. You see work that you like, that you're drawn to, and for me, it was certain photographers that I really admired and looked up to. And I was just trying to figure out what it was that I wanted to do. And one of the things and I kind of go through this with the book, if we're talking about syntax, a lot of these things end up being geometrical concepts and how they relate to one another. For instance, the idea of negative space. If you have, there's no negative space in this frame that you're seeing tonight, maybe my shirt, but, your subject is going to be a higher energy than what's around it. And so if you're shooting a portrait, for instance, on a white wall, having a lot of negative space, and you're going to get that balance because the energy is higher where your subject is, the negative space you need more of to balance that energy out. And so there's little things like that come into play. And it kind of leads to the question is there's a lot of photography that may not be as dependent on the subject. The subject can become a little bit secondary. I remember when I was starting out, I had a friend who would call me, and we were both kind of camera nerds, and we would go shoot. And he'd always call me, I'm bored. What do you want to go shoot? And it was always be this big discussion of where we were going to go. And the idea behind that was that we were going to go somewhere that was going to open up this whole potential of new stuff. But I also found that if I wasn't just shooting all the time, I would be making bad pictures in a cool place. So you need something to practice with and kind of go with. And back to my music thing, when I was in music school, I played guitar and then I had to learn functional piano and all that. And everybody practiced all the time. I mean, you would dedicate several hours a day to practicing the instrument. And it always was interesting to me that when you get into photography, photographers didn't do that. They weren't as aware of other, like musicians are aware of other musicians. Photographers were a lot less aware of other photographers. And they didn't have that commitment to practicing all the time. In fact, I'm going into a dangerous territory because you are at a camera store, but we have so much that's automated on a camera now when they're talking about things like AI algorithms and autofocus and to where you just half press the shutter and go. That doesn't mean you have a good picture, right? There still is that element that you have to go seek out.
Yeah, we do. We do like when people buy a camera from us, we have an intro to photography class. And
yeah, you guys are really good about that.
And everybody, and I teach privately as well. And it's people when I talk, they want to know the specs. Oh man, this camera can do 30 frames a second. This one can do more, and the resolution, and this and that. And I preach to them the basics, right? I said you have to understand
right.
the exposure because you can have 30 underexposed images. Doesn't matter, right?
Yeah.
You're
Right.
messing up. It's not helpful.
Or 30 overexposed images. I mean,
Totally,
yeah,
right?
or no, and in today's terms, it's 120, or it probably is 10,000 by the time you get back from the shoot because you can gun so fast on these
100%.
cameras. And maybe that's, there are certain people who have a need for that kind of speed, but I highly suggest it's probably not everybody. And I remember I was doing a talk at my local camera store. This was a couple years back. And I was doing this big thing like we're talking about now, and I got to this high point where I was really getting serious and passionate about it. And I said, I will tell you something. And I pointed onto the sales floor, and I said, if you can't go out there and with any camera that's sitting out there and get a good picture, the problem is probably not with the camera. It's probably with the person shooting it.
I totally agree, right? Because we get pushed for the technical aspects of a camera, right? Because it's force fed to us. Oh, this camera's got this much resolution. This camera can focus this fast and track this. But does it make the image? Does it really have an emotional response to this image and that quality? And that's where I think like certain camera brands, like Leica, and why are always the heated debate, which is the best focal length for this or for that? And it always comes down to, 28, 35, 50, right? Like it's like three lenses. And why is those three lenses the most popular lenses like that, the most heated debates about? And for me,
that is a fascinating question. And I remember a couple of years ago, well, it was more than a couple of years ago, but when I first had the opportunity to study with Ralph Gibson, that was a huge deal for me because I'd always been such a big fan of his work, and he was doing some teaching stuff. And so, of course, I was there and signed up. And when I was studying with Ralph, we got through all of our lessons, and it was the last one. And he made the point. He said, here's the deal. I want you to really put an effort in, practice the stuff, and take all these concepts. He said, but you're going to do it with a 50 millimeter lens and a rangefinder. And it was a weird Zen slap for me at the time because, the rangefinder is a pretty dated instrument. It goes back to the 50s. And, with what we can do with autofocus. And I took that to heart, and I used a 50 millimeter lens. My goal was to use... Of course, I have a YouTube channel and I do review gear. So I didn't just shoot with a 50, but for all my personal work, I limited it to 50 for the first year. And then I actually went a second year with it. And I found it so interesting to start seeing that way because you're removing options that you have as a photographer. And I'm just talking about personal work. I understand if you need a wide, you need a wide. If you need a telephoto, you need a telephoto. But just working with the 50, it took all those options off the table and it allowed me, just from an artistic standpoint, to really explore what 50 millimeters meant and how close I needed to get or how far back I needed to get or what I could expect to get in the frame. And really quickly, within a month, you're starting to see the world in 50 millimeters and you kind of know what to expect. And I remember the other thing that Ralph said to me is he said, you may not like 50 millimeters. It may not be your focal length, but you can't argue the fact that there are more photographs that are famous in the history of photography that were done on a 50 millimeter lens. Like Henri Cartier-Bresson, that's all he used his entire career. It's all 50. There may have been a 35 in there once or twice, but it's largely 50. And you're right, that does become a debate because the range from 35 to even 90 is, Sony comes out with the 12 to 24 and we have these extreme wides and then we've got ultra telephotos and the last lens that Sony did was the 50 to 150, which is a fabulous lens.
It is a stunning piece of glass.
How are we just now seeing that? That's a great range,
But it's the thing. We get asked all the time here, what's your favorite camera? What do you go out and shoot with? And I'm like, it really depends. If I'm out, we did a review of the Sigma 300 to 600 recently, right? And it's this monstrosity. Right. It's 8.5 pounds, right? It's a big lens, but I really enjoyed it. But I'm not a wildlife guy full time. Right?
No,
what do I love? I fell in love with a 35 millimeter a few years ago, and that I keep resonating with me. That for me does it, right? 50 mils are always a little too tight. I like a 35, right? And this is, if I had to choose, that'd be my desert island lens. So
you could probably shoot with that for an entire year and do just fine. You know.
So this is the thing. Is you step above the technical aspects of photography, right? Because when I'm teaching people and I'm drilling in the basics, the foundations of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, and once you kind of understand that, then photography gets really amazing because then you can put your own creative juices into the photos. You can put your passion into it. Do I want to drag the shutter? Do I want to freeze the motion, right? Basic questions like this, and you get people thinking about what they want to achieve and what they want to look, and they can look at a scene and say, okay, here's the tool at my disposal, here's how much light I have, what effect do I want?
Yeah, absolutely. And you need less than you think you do. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago, I started shooting ballet. I got real serious about shooting that as a subject that I wanted to explore. And I remember I was shooting this live performance, and I was on a camera that did not have in-body image stabilization, and I had this idea: what if I dragged the shutter down to, let's say, a 15th of a second was kind of the magic number, and I ended up getting some shots I was really happy with, and I noticed that when I was looking at them, what the technologists will tell you is that you have to have in-body image stabilization to shoot that slow. And the reality was, so the way they worked is I would have one dancer. The idea came, there was one dancer, and then the other dancers were dancing around them, but the person in the middle was still. And when I was looking at the pictures, the one thing I noticed is that your mental perception of that shot, the person in the middle was still enough. If you zoom in and eyeball it, yes, there's blur, but because you had so much blur going around it, that contrast offset that. And so while, yeah, okay, if you're going to shoot at a 15th of a second and you need everything sharp, yeah, you probably do need embodied image stabilization. But it was a system where it's like I kind of liked the organic look that I got, where it was just your eye. And the same thing with focus and using a rangefinder. And I realize I know that Leica are outrageously expensive, and I wish there were other options, and they weren't the only game in town with a rangefinder. But there's something about a rangefinder when you're slightly out of focus and the picture still works. You realize that autofocus isn't as required as you may think it needs to be. You either have a picture or you don't, right?
Yeah, no, I have to admit,
I've had pictures that are out of focus and they still work.
that's the thing. And I found myself, there's been times where I'm editing photos and it's my kids and stuff. I'm like punching in and I'm like, this should be sharper. And I'm like on the delete button and I'm like, no, it's still a good shot. This still works.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. And the opposite has true too. I'll get a perfectly technical photograph that's in focus or whatever. Like, we've been on the press trips together, and I remember when Sony were doing a lot of their sports lenses, like the 400 millimeter and later the 6 and all that. I think we were on one of those together, and I would go shoot, and they got us onto the field of a New Jersey soccer game, and I'm not a sports guy. I mean, that is so out of my league, and I don't follow soccer, so I can't anticipate what's going to happen. It's just not. There's nothing passionate about it for me. But my point is like you'd use the Sony and it crazy good autofocus and the lenses are awesome. And I would get shots that were technically fine. And they didn't speak to me at all when I was looking at them on the card. And then that's the other problem is like the high speed shooting. Like you come back with thousands of images that you've got to go through. And it's like, are you kidding me?
To some degree, and I remember that trip.
Slightly moving.
I remember that trip, and I got some really good shots from that trip. I remember, and but I think with long lenses, you're photographing passion, or I think with wider angle lenses, you're photographing your passion.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
You can use that. That's a good tagline. That's a good one. Your next book, you can use that.
But I credit Dave on that. But I mean, that is well said, and I think that I think that people have to, and you guys probably deal with this a lot too, because the industry, so to speak, is telling you need things like incredible autofocus, and Sony's going to be the best, but doesn't mean maybe a Canon the best camera for you, or a Fujifilm, or whatever it is. There's so many choices out there, and the reality is that we're spoiled to the point where, I mean, you and I started shooting back when it was just film, and cameras were pretty crude compared to what they can do now. But they're really good at telling you need this ultra wide angle or you need a telephoto. You know how often I shoot on an ultra wide angle? Just about never. I mean, I have one, but I don't need like 5 of them. I mean, because I don't shoot that wide. If you're doing architectural all the time, sure, but it's finding what. The gear, it's funny because like there's this split between, and I've experienced this with my YouTube channel, the camp that the gear doesn't matter and the camp that, well, they're all about gear. Well, the gear matter. I mean, you can't not shoot with a camera. I mean, unless you're doing photograms, but we're not doing that. And so it does matter to a degree, but it's about finding what's going to matter to you and what's going to be most appropriate.
I've been using the word resonate a lot more recently.
Yeah.
Like hotly debated camera is Fuji's new X-Half camera, where you're dealing with a smaller sensor in a much more creative fashion, and it's got some kind of trick features to it. And are those photos less impactful because of the resolution, because of the
hell no,
right? Compared to a camera with massive resolution. So it's trying to find
that's overrated too. You know that. I mean, but that actually raises a really good point, because to give you guys a little bit of context, before we started rolling the live, Dave and I were sitting here setting up and we were just kind of talking, and we were comparing notes on latest things. With things like the Fujifilm, and they've been really pushing a lot of creative aspects of things, but the whole craze of the fixed lens camera right now is fascinating to me because just like I said earlier, the whole idea that I shot with a 50 millimeter lens for all my personal work for it ended up being 2 years, and I still default back to 50 a lot. I found that I actually like a little bit longer, like a 75 or an 85. But that being said, though, the fixed lens camera forces you to have less options at your disposal. And one thing that I teach workshops, and one thing that I'm always telling students. I was in Japan last year with a group of students, and the whole thing is, I had a couple students. They've got bags of gear that they're going to carry around all day. And it's like you've got so many options that you're going to spend all day changing lenses and trying to figure out what's best. And there was this situation where we were in Kyoto and we were kind of in this neighborhood and we gotten off the train. We're going to walk up to this temple. And we'd gotten off the train and we were kind of regrouping. And all of a sudden somebody says, "Hey, check out the monkey." And this monkey comes out of the back of a house and shimmies up a phone pole, crawls over the wire and goes to the other side and he was gone. I'm sitting there like trying to get my Hasselblad to boot up because it was so slow. And another guy's over there changing lenses. And my friend Randy, who's on that trip, he had the Nikon Z7, not even the Z7 II, and a 50 millimeter lens, and he's the one who got the shot. So it can be excessive. So I like the idea of going out with one lens and you cannot remove, and this is what you're working with. Take all the options off the table and see what you can explore creatively within that.
Well,
And I think if you
I
do
look
that
at those
consistently enough, it works.
yeah, I look at those single lens cameras kind of as your daily carry, right? You don't know sure what you're going to see, what's going to
Sure.
happen, right? And that's just your go-to. You've got something that's going to capture something differently than your phone's going to capture, but it's your everyday carry camera.
It
Where
is, and you will be forced to find a way to make it work. So, for instance, the monkey's going up the pole. Randy's shooting with a 50. He had a high megapixel camera, so he ended up cropping a little bit for an image. But there's other techniques that you can use to isolate subjects, or especially when you start to learn how to. I mean, I always think of it like, a focal length has kind of a signature to it, right? A 28 mil, I can recognize. It's got the certain amount of distortion to it, and it looks cool. 50 kind of has that too. 35, all the focal lengths do when you use them enough.
yeah,
And when you learn to contextualize, like let's just say you're going to shoot on 35 for the next year, and you see something that's in the distance. Well, there's things you can do, and these are covered in the book a little bit. Like if you can subframe something, so it's the concept of like you've got this rectangle that you're working in, that's your frame. If you have other objects in the frame, and all of a sudden you get my eye in here, my eye is taking up maybe 1/100th of the entire image, but you're drawn to it because I've framed it in, right? So there's techniques that you can do to kind of make things work for you creatively, and that's what's important to learn as a photographer, I think.
yeah. So that's what I mean. I mean, looking through your book here, I mean, commented on it earlier. I mean, just you got 21 chapters. But
Hmm.
you don't just say, okay, here's chapter 1, aperture, chapter 2, shutter speed, chapter
Right.
3, which I really appreciate. I mean, chapter 7, you're talking about negative space already, and
Yeah.
that's impressive. But you things like syntax, visual balance, compositional techniques, and symbolism and metaphor. Like, you're getting pretty deep here, Ted. I mean,
Well, Dave, the reality is that most people, let's be honest, the iPhone changed everything. It used to be when you and I were young, when we were kids, like my dad always had a camera. Because you're capturing the family moments, you're capturing the soccer games, and you didn't have the iPhone option. Nothing fit in your pocket back then. It was a lot of gear, and it got big. And so that was another thing. It's like the chances of somebody like wanting to purchase my book to learn what aperture means or what shutter speed does is pretty slim. I mean, I cover them to a small extent in there, but the reality is that you go pick any camera off the shelf in your store right now. There's a fully auto mode. You put it in P, or there's usually like the IA mode or AI mode or whatever. And you don't have to think about those things anymore. You learn how to compensate for it if you want a darker picture or a brighter picture. What I wanted to do with the chapters in this book was to just get into, let's talk about making pictures and forget all the other stuff, because like use your phone and you can do all this thing. Right. Yeah, they probably are, right? Right. You are. And what's funny, I don't know if you guys have done a lot of phone reviews on your channel. I don't know that you have. Chris has done it for a while. But when I went through a period right around 2020 where I thought that, well, I need to cover phones because that's the gateway and, for views and whatever. And it sort of worked. But at the same time, though, the one thing I noticed when I go do all my test shots is the phones have gotten so good at computational imaging, which everybody talks about, and they want it in the main cameras, people think. Uh, but the computational imaging is that the computer part of the phone or the AI algorithms or whatever are trying to determine what's going to be a balanced exposure. And if you can underexpose on a phone and overexpose if that's the way you want to go. And I've found that I'm always fighting the computational stuff behind it. Like if I underexpose, it's still kind of pulling it in the direction I don't want it to go. And so for those reasons, it's like, I mean, sure, I have a phone and I use it, but I really prefer a camera because that's my tool and it's my instrument, and that's what I'm able to um, to just work with. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. You can get great images with the phone, and it's just they're all tools. But it's like that's what the book's about is like, understanding how elements in the frame work with one another. Those are the things that are going to make you a smarter photographer and probably a more emotional photographer because you're able to communicate what it is that you're trying to say. Not that everything has to be this heavy ordeal of communication that's this some sage statement. You could be just photographing your dog, but you have a more interesting picture to look at later because you kind of understand composition and how objects work with one another and relationships within the frame, and how even the relationship of, say you're shooting your dog, the relationship of the dog with well, we're in 16 by 9 right now, but with the 2 by 3 or 4 by 5 or 4 by 3 aspect ratio that you're working with. So you're not muted, but do we have any questions? Because I don't want to ignore people if they're asking things. Yeah, you sound good here. I think so. That was the intent. I mean, a lot of it, Dave, is when I started and when I wanted to write this book, the question was, would this book be good for a beginner if somebody didn't hear it? And the whole intention was, when I first picked up a camera, it's a little bit different than today because there were no phones when I first picked up a camera. So today you just pick it up and you shoot, right? Back then there was the daunting task of understanding what the shutter speed dial did and what's the difference between 60 and 120 and 30 and what do these numbers mean, or the f-stops on the lens. And I didn't, and in film it was a fixed ISO depending on what film you were using. And there was a little more of a barrier to entry in just understanding the basics until like even the Nikon F3 came out. But today you have a phone, and so the reality is most beginners are probably starting there, and the technology is such that we have automation to the level where you don't have to worry about those things. So the amazing thing about it is that looking back, I wish I had started with thinking more about the image than the technology that I'm trying to use to get it. Because that's always, I mean, here's the thing. You go to a museum or an art gallery or, any place where photographs are displayed and you see something that is of interest and you start looking at it. I have never, ever seen one person in a gallery or a museum turn around and say, was this a Nikon or a Canon? Do you think this was the 85 1.4 or was it an f.2? They just don't ask those questions. And it doesn't matter as much as you think it is. The end result matters. And so the tools might matter to you to get to the end result. For instance, if you're doing macro, or if you want to do something that's selective focus where you really are dependent on a really shallow depth of field, and those are a little more advanced. And yeah, okay, those things do matter. But even then, I've never seen anybody in a gallery say, "Wonder what the f-stop was," or I mean, maybe they will if it's super out of focus, but they're never going to say, "Was that the Leica Noctilux or was that the Sony?" What? They just don't care. I mean, and it doesn't matter. They're not interested in that. They're interested in the picture,
No,
and
100%.
that's
I
what
agree.
ultimately matters.
It was actually, it dawned on me actually doing the review on the Fuji X Half and actually and the Instax Wide Evo. These were cameras.
Yeah, you don't have a lot of depth of field.
No,
Yeah.
and I actually had a lot of fun shooting with these cameras. And we have people buying very expensive cameras. And if you buy a very expensive camera, you want to see very high quality images come out of that very expensive camera. But also, the people that you're showing your photos to expect for someone who spent so much money on camera gear to be producing some really amazing images. And if they're not up to par, they don't feel it, right? There's some additional pressure. Where you're like that X half was a lot of fun because there wasn't any expectations of high quality photos, right? They were all about fun and the experience. And I think we lose that a little bit. So like there are some expensive cameras like the Leica M11. I mean, we were in New York. I was in New York when they launched it. And sent me on the streets with a 50 mil, right, and a Leica M11, and we walked and walked and walked. I mean, I cannot get enough of that city and walking around and just shooting. And I screwed up a lot of shots because it was technically a very challenging camera to shoot with, and especially at nighttime. And I had to rethink how I shot, but it was an amazing exercise. So
both are fun in their own ways. But there is an element to what you just said though that is very important. If you're not having fun with it, then adjust something, because photography should be that. Even for people. So one of the things within my career, I did a little docuseries years ago on working photographers that I looked up to, and I got a lot of good interviews, and I met some of my heroes doing that, and even when people are working really hard to get shots or a series or a thing that they're working on that is technically very difficult, they're all having fun while they're doing it. If it becomes arduous, then and so things like the Fujifilm half frame, I think hats off, man. If you've got a daily driver camera, the other thing too is there's different kinds of photographs. There's photographs that, I come from more of the art side of things, and there's work that is, I would call, more serious or heady or whatever. But then there's also like just moments of your life that you're capturing, and I was fairly recently looking back through my archive of stuff, and there's certain photographs that are not great, but I'm glad I have them because they help me to remember things. They're more of a diary kind of. I did an interview last year with Sam Abel, who's a fabulous photographer, and he was talking. He had this picture he was showing me. At one point, he broke his back.
Oh, geez.
And he was staying with some friends while he was recovering, and he had this crazy shot. They had a pet owl, and so the shot is in a shower, and you see the shower rod sticking out, like he's on top of the shower rod shooting, and there's an owl sitting in the shower with him, and he said, I did that with my diary camera, and I said, tell me about the diary camera, and he said it was just a Leica. He always had black. This was in the film days. Always had black and white film, and at the time the Leica was much smaller than a lot of the SLR cameras that he was carrying around, and it was just, he wasn't going for, I mean, this was a great shot, but that's not what he was going for. It was just moments that are important to capture in your life that are day to day, and they remind you of those things, and I think that's such a beautiful pursuit. And I know people who that's all they pursue, and I think that's awesome. And if they can make the best images out of that, they're not expecting them to be on the walls of the Met, or they're just what they are, which are important to the person who's taking them. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I encourage, even when people get really serious about photography and they think that they need to make the next Bresson or Bernie Sabat or whatever, you still need to have fun with it and realize that there's beauty in those moments that sometimes they're only personal to you,
Oh yeah, you
and
look
then
at these,
now and then they're right.
Some of these photographs that are legendary photographs, and technically you're like, oh man, like they're not as sharp as they could be. They're not as exposed as they could be. Right? But what makes that photo so powerful with that? So it's more than just the gear. You have to have something that produced there. Let's talk about more.
You're saying that, but Henri Cartier-Bresson comes to mind because the famous shot of the bicycle, and there's a staircase in the front.
Yeah.
And people, you see it online all the time. The people will put that on their blog, and they'll draw the arrows on it, showing they're analyzing the composition. And the reality is that Bresson called those waiter photographs, and so basically you would wait for something to happen. So he had the staircase framed up, and you just waited for the bicycle to come through. Simple as it is, if you hyperanalyze that, the staircase blurs a little bit, the bicycle's way out of focus because it's moving. It's a great shot. You either have the shot or you don't. And those little perfections, you're overthinking. You don't have a shot if you're dependent on those.
No,
Sorry, I interrupted you.
I
You were going
think
to say something, but
we
I
look
felt
at
passionate to say that. So
100%. Yeah, I think we look at our images way too critically, and
we do.
I mean, actually, working here at the store, it's the latest.
Well,
and
you've got
greatest.
60 megapixels in a zoom tool. That's what yeah, the problem.
Yeah, and so I mean, I always show people this picture of a gopher of all things, shot with the Fuji GFX 100, and I'm like, here's
Perfect.
this shot of a gopher, and then I show them a 1 megapixel crop of this gopher, right? And it's just the head, and it's incredibly detailed, and I'm like, you look at this shot, and if you had a street scene or something, how many ways you can crop this images and still have very usable resolution? That part's intoxicating, I have to admit. I mean, having the
How many
actual
megapixels is that camera, by the way?
100.
Wow.
Yeah.
So here's the deal with 100 megapixels, and this idea goes back to the 50s when Harper's Bazaar and Vogue were the redesigned magazines of Madison Avenue, and you had Irving Penn and Richard Avedon, and they were doing all this stuff. At the time, 35 millimeter had become this revolutionary format, but it was so small to enlarge it, you had grain. And so Hasselblad and the medium format cameras came in, and the whole idea was so the editor could crop things in post. And there's a huge argument between cropping in post and cropping in camera, and people ask me about that a lot, and I always say whatever gets the shot. I don't have this purity complex of you have to. Now I do say try to get it in camera because you're going to save yourself a lot of post-production time, and you improve your eye and what you're capturing. And but yeah, it is interesting the fact that that we have cameras with 100 megapixels. That's insane, or 150 if you go phase one,
That it is a bit nutty in the trickle down of technology, because your computer, whatever you have, isn't fast enough once you start this
it really is
very
not,
slippery
no.
slope. We got a question from Hall's Emporium.
Yeah.
And you've had the pleasure of coming up here during our Stampede season here, which if you've never been to Calgary during Stampede season, it's another entity all of itself. But he says, what was your favorite subject?
She says that Hall's Emporium. I know Jen Hall, so you do too. It's Jen.
What was what was your favorite subject at the Calgary Stampede?
Oh, that is. Hold on.
Because you actually.
That is a good question. So I was up there summer before last. Went to the Calgary Stampede. There were. If we're going to limit this to the Stampede, I think it was the stock show, because for those who are not familiar with rodeo who might be joining us, usually there's a stock show, and this is where people come to trade and sell livestock. And there's llamas back there, and like horses and cows, and I mean it's incredible. And to be able to go photograph it, because it feels behind the scenes. The rodeo is hard to shoot unless you are down close and have press access. I think the livestock was my favorite, but my favorite thing to photograph in Calgary, we went, I was telling Dave about this earlier, we drove about an hour north of Calgary and went into a smaller town, and they did one of the small town rodeos, and I thought it was just magical. I mean, you've got access anywhere. They're cool. They're really neat.
Cool. If I'm looking at your book here, was there a chapter that was particularly difficult for you to write about? Both technically or
honestly,
just sort of
I think
creatively?
that's a good question. When I got towards the end, I get into stuff about legacy and all that. And the difficult part about that is what people perceive as legacy. And it's one thing when you're Richard Avedon or you're Henri Cartier-Bresson or you're Irving Penn, or, they have massive legacies. They impacted and inspired photographers for generations beyond them. But my point of that is that we all kind of have a legacy of what we're going to leave behind us, and what is that? And it's interesting because I actually had a student. I did a workshop last week. It was online, small group, and the way it worked is we would meet every 2 days, and on the day in between, they'd have an assignment to do. But they all got a one-on-one with me. And one of my students asked me in there, he said, one thing that I struggle with is, in terms of legacy, so to speak, is my own style. He said, I feel like I shoot all kinds of things and this and that. And I thought about it. I said, the deal is that, I'm a child of the 70s and 80s. And when I was a kid, every industry had the rock stars. Like, you have literal rock stars, like what bands are popular, who's who, guitar players, but also within like graphic design, there were designers that everybody looked up to. There were illustrators that everybody looked up to. Anything in the creative business, you always had these heroes. And that continued up through the 90s, and around 2000, a lot of that stopped. And even like because radio is so insignificant now with music that genres are all over the place. Like you remember when grunge was big and it was
Yeah.
like one genre everybody was into. And so now I think that it's changed a lot. And I think that as photographers, the bar is set high to where maybe you don't have to be specific with something. I mean, I don't know how much gallery work there is anymore, but to shoot in a specific style, I think sometimes I'm really impressed with photographers who have a lot of range to what they can do. They can do weddings, they can do fine art, they can do portraits, they can, whatever, because that is difficult. And so that was a difficult chapter to write because, like, what does legacy mean to people and what is it? And, the best I could come up with, and I distilled it down to this, is that, when I first got on Instagram, what I loved about it is that, this was back in the days where there were still blogs. Facebook, people would read these long posts or whatever, but Instagram was images only. This is before it supported
Yeah.
video. And at its best, I could keep up with my cousins who are not photographers, but they're being forced to show you what's going on in their lives visually. And I loved it because they didn't even know that they were doing a good job at it. And I get it. Instagram's a entity that needs to make money for Meta and all that, and so they've changed it to capture your attention more. But it's sad because at its best, that's what it was. It wasn't about commanding your attention. It was about seeing people communicate with pictures instead of words. And I think as a result, we probably today have a more visually literate society than we've had in a long time. I think that people understand visuals a little more. I think that people are able to do short form video even, with social media. And when they're really good at it, it resonates with friends and family or maybe even strangers and when they really get successful. So yeah, that was a tough chapter to write because also I knew it would become dated really fast. It was already dated when I wrote it because I'm talking about early days of Instagram and that was just 3 years ago. So that was the tough one.
Interesting. Dave Albers Photography says, what do you do to find new ways of inspiration to feed your creativity?
That's a great question. That is, first of all, let me say that is really important for every photographer. You got to stay inspired. And look, the reality is some days we're not feeling so inspired. It's just what it is. Sometimes that's factors of what's going on in our lives. That's what's on our plate, or that we've just shot a bunch of stuff. And for me, a big turnaround was this was when we hit COVID in 2020. And, at the beginning when we're all under lockdown and it's very surreal and you're home all the time. I remember I couldn't get to sleep at night a couple times because I'd just been here all day, And I'd be sitting in bed and I remember thinking back then, okay, here's the deal. And I would be talking to myself, we're going to come out of this. And so, like, now's the time to start thinking about what do you want to do? What do I want to change? And I realized that I had never really been drawn to a specific subject other than when I started, I did a lot of botanical still life kinds of things. And, taking that as far as I wanted to, and I thought it was time for something new. And at that time, I decided a couple things. I mean, one of them was ballet. I'd always loved ballet. There were artists that I liked that had done really interesting things with that. And it's something I'd never shot. And so, like, I started following dancers on Instagram that were local. And then I went to the ballet a few times. Like, you got to get into it and to get access. And eventually, I got to the point where that became a subject, and I knew some people who were doing it. And for me, I finally found something that meant something to me that I felt had enough visual potential to explore further. And then the second one for me was, and this was so random, and Dave, you may have been on this trip when Panasonic released the S5 II. Were you guys on that? And took us to Tokyo?
No, sadly I was not.
That was the first one, and then we went again a year ago for Osaka. And I thought, I would love to shoot Japan more. And maybe there's a way to do that. And I wanted to do a workshop there. And I was too chicken to do it because of the language barrier. And then I realized I have a really good friend who's an excellent photographer. And he lived there for 10 years. He speaks Japanese. His wife is Japanese. And so I hit him up and said, would you like to co-do this with me? And he did. And so we did our first trip last year. So it's the third time I've been to Japan. And the thing that fascinates me about Japan, it's harder to do because I can't go there every day. But there's such a depth of culture there, of things that I was telling somebody the other day, Sebastião Salgado passed away this last week, the great Brazilian photographer. And there's this great interview where he's talking about his secret to identifying with the subject. And one, you have to have an interest in the subject, and two, you have to have enough interest in the subject to really explore it in depth. So it's more than just your photograph. It has to be the subject coming back to it. So I think that it's a long-winded way of answering the question. If you're looking for ways to stay motivated and inspired, I think you need to look for subject material that you can really go on an exploration with. For me, it was ballet and then Japan. And so I kind of have two that I'm doing. But even if you can find one, and it doesn't have to be exotic, it can be something that's local. Like, what if you did, if I lived, let's just say I lived in Calgary, I love doing the rodeo stuff. What if you did an in-depth exploration on rodeo pictures? And really tried to gain access and meet people that would get you closer into seeing things. And I have a friend who does rodeo, and he's really good. And that's his thing. That's what his point of exploration is. It's a point of departure, essentially. It's like what is going to capture your interest enough to keep doing it from different angles and explore new things. And I think it has to be a subject that continues to have potential. Like for me, ballet, it's not like I've shot it twice and I feel like I've done everything I can do with it. It's like there are questions there that I kind of keep wanting to explore. Slow shutter speeds. I want to do more with the portrait element, or the whole idea of subtraction, where you don't have faces in the frame so much, but it's the gesture and the body
Right.
motion that comes into play. And then I'm interested,
Well, I think
and then it's easy.
when you're dealing with a subject that you're passionate about or really, really like, whether it's wedding photography, whether it's portraits, whatever it is that
Be
the
anything.
more you shoot it, the more you're looking for those nuances, because you're recognizing and understanding it more and more, and then you're starting to see, okay, this is a good photo, this is a great photo,
Yeah.
right? And it's all these
Like,
subtleties.
yeah, Dave, I have the most utmost respect. I shot one wedding early in my career, and that was no more. But when I see people who do that, and you can, and people who are, and there's a lot of people who do it, and there's few people who are really good at it. And when you talk to those few people who are really good at it, it's the same thing. They love doing it. It draws them in more, and they found something that really speaks to them, and they don't want to stop photographing it. And that's the kind of thing, when you're talking about inspiration, it has to speak to you, which is brings up another thought that I have on photography, which I later had an opportunity to study with Sam Abel. And one thing he was always talking about is he likes to build photographs from the background forward. And I love this idea. I'd never thought of photography that way. And so you have a scene, and then all of a sudden, like maybe you have a figure or something that's coming through the scene, or a horse, or whatever it is that you're shooting. And my problem is I would always inflect my personal desires on what the subject was. Okay, look, this guy on a horse is coming up, and he's going to do this thing, and I'm going to be ready for. He never does that thing, right?
Yeah.
So what I learned through that is there's an element of where you have to let photography give back to you. And this is one of the only visual art mediums that does this. You have to be open to the subject that's going to give something to you. But the reason I brought this up, in a long-winded way of answering your question, but if you're going to be inspired by something, it does need to be something that gives back to you. And if you haven't found it, look at new things. Look at other photographers. Look at work. What excites you? What gets you interested in things? It could be something as simple as when I first started shooting. I didn't have access to anything. I didn't have a lot of time. I had a day job. I didn't have any money. And so my thing was I would go to the grocery store and I would buy flowers. And I love shooting botanicals. And I got into Carl Blossfeld and Tom Burrell and all these guys that were shooting these amazing still lifes with botanicals, or even like, 16th, 17th century painters. And so I would set these up in my loft at night. And I was shooting black and white film. And I'm making a point with this. I would go to Home Depot and I would buy like floodlights. And then I learned how to put a sheet over it from Target, and that would diffuse it enough. And so but I was learning about lighting, and I didn't have any money at the time. And so it was just like, there's always a way. But I found a subject that I was interested enough in to where I could like want to do that every night. And that's what I did for 2 or 3 years. And then kind of got tired of it, moved on. But that's, I think, finding a subject that is true to your heart and what you're interested in is important.
Yeah, I've got a question from, this is an interesting one. See how this got hotly debated. But
I'm very verbose, Dave. Just cut me off if I'm talking too much.
Jeff X, it says, will it be harder to make a living as a photographer, especially with AI coming?
That's a great question, and I'm going to be blunt with you. I don't give it. I don't care. I was going to say something else, but we're a family show here. I really don't care, and here's why. And that's a personal choice. AI is, especially, you guys probably saw a couple days ago, the new Google engine that does video. starting to look pretty good. And the thing is that I'm not um, I'm not afraid of it because AI trains on what has come before it. It trains on previous models. And if you're in my world, like I want to create new things. And so I'm not worried about AI. I mean, it might be right on my heels, but I think human beings will always find a way to persevere. Now, if you're trying to do this for a living, I realize that is a different story completely. And there is some weird stuff coming up because, like, for instance, if you've ever done commercial work and you've worked with a design studio or an ad agency, the budgets are smaller and they want to be it cheaper and they want it faster. AI fulfills those needs. And I guarantee you, I've seen online, Google ads serving me AI stuff all the time. Right now, you can tell it's AI. There's the uncanny valley thing still.
Yeah.
And they may be able to get past that one day. But the thing is, it's like photography for me is a participatory idea of something that I'm creating work and that satisfies me. And I understand that if you're looking at doing that from a commercial standpoint and you're relying on your living to do that, that is a very frightening possibility. But at the same time, I don't know, it ups the bar again. We've got to create new things and we've got to do something. If you're working for a living doing anything creative, my dad used to tell me this. He's a painter. He used to say, I mean, he's an illustrator, and there are no illustrators anymore. Stock illustration put that out of business, and nobody uses illustration anyway. But he said, if you want to have a career, you've got to find what you do well and who's willing to pay for it. And like his career's pivoted into like he does paintings for golf courses now. They can't get stock photography or AI to do that. So, the clubhouse has famous competitions that he paints on the greens and so there's always a way you can do it. I don't let it get me down. I know a lot of people get really upset about that, but there's about three or four reasons packed into there as to why
a lot of people are like threatened by it, but in reality, right, you create your own content, you create what you want to see. So actually, this brings up
absolutely.
Thomas Hayek says the book shows an exercise used to show students the idea of figure-ground relationship. Do you ask them to arrange the shapes to create a feeling, or do they arrange them freely and see what it feels like?
That's an interesting take. Yeah. So good question. Arrange them freely, but I think the other thing is I have a little more text in there where I talk about what the effect is on certain things. So you can do this with a camera too. In fact, I have a new thing that I'm going to start teaching where I just use a camera. So after I had graduated music school and all this, I went back to school again. I did not get a second degree, but I just took some graphic design classes because I wanted to understand composition. And one of my teachers had us do that. And so that's where that came from, full disclosure. And so the idea is that you literally cut out a black piece of paper, and that's your ground. And in photography terms, this is a 2x3 rectangle that you're going to be shooting with all the time because that's 35 mil or maybe square or whatever it is. And so arranging little pointed objects on there. The point of it is that they will have relationships to one another, but they also, that's the figure. The ground is the paper you're putting on, but they also have a relationship to the ground. So you need to understand that the relationship to each other is very important, as is the relationship to the ground. And the main thing is that in the middle of the image is pretty low energy, right? So how many photographs have you seen of a portrait where the person is smack dab in the middle of the image? It's safe. There's low energy there. It's a photograph. It's beautiful. It works, whatever. When you put things near the edge, the energy level raises. And so it draws more tension because things are near the edge. And so this is a really important technique to understand because it does impact how you take photographs. There are so many people that in the end, your photographs can live and die by the edges. And inevitably, because I've done it too, something will sneak into your picture if you're shooting street photography, or like, let's say you're shooting a portrait of somebody or a wedding shot, and there's a plant that you didn't see when you were shooting, but it's on the edge. And because it's on the edge, it has a high amount of energy to it. And so cropping could bring it up. But anyway, so those are important things to understand with composition. So yeah, you can move them around freely and kind of use your own eye with it, but do understand the effects of what's going on. So the answer is both. but not one without the other. Because you don't want to play by the rules all the time. Then you're painting by numbers, and that's not interesting to anybody. And I don't think your images will be interesting. But at the same time, if you just go by the gut and go by feel, I don't think you're getting enough of why,
Fair enough.
So the answer's in the middle.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, we're going to start wrapping up here pretty shortly here, but what do
Yeah,
you
I
want
answer
people-
my own questions by long explanations. So yeah.
I mean, what do you want people to take away from your book? I mean, if I read this from cover to cover, am I going to be a better photographer at the end of it? Am I going to be a better communicator through a visual medium?
I like that a lot. My intention is that you will be more thoughtful about photography, is what it is. It's a different way of looking at photography. You look at rules, traditional, so to speak, and they're there, and they're there for a reason. And like I always bag on rule of thirds, but I mean, some guys, when you get into, like, if you guys ever want to Google this dynamic symmetry, this really bothered me a few years ago, because there's a whole school of thought of people who get into this idea of dynamic symmetry, which involves. It goes back to the Renaissance and Da Vinci, and there's all like these rules of how angles need to add up, and it's just so stifling that there's no creativity at all. And it definitely is a paint by numbers kind of coloring book situation. And I don't think that any of us get into photography because we want a coloring book. We want to make something that is more important, that's more impactful, that's more thoughtful. And so I think that really, I mean, that's the bottom line with my book, is that I want just people to, it's a new way of thinking about photography, or a different way of thinking about photography that might impact and inspire people to create something that they hadn't thought of before with an image. And I don't care if it's, here's another thing. Like, if it, let's take the subject out of the equation. If I'm a good photographer, I've got a light over here, I should be able to make something interesting out of the stand or the light, or, is it going to be the greatest photo I've ever taken? Probably not. But as a good photographer, I should be able to do something interesting with whatever subject matter I'm given. And so my feeling has always been, when you practice photography, and everybody who's watching this tonight, go do this tomorrow or tonight if you still have time, is just find something around your house and try to make an interesting photograph out of it. Is that going to be your greatest work? No, but you're practicing. And then that way, next time you're in Japan, or you're in England, or you're in Norway, or wherever exotic location you're in, then you're going to be making some interesting images there, because you're using your eye and you're understanding how things compose in a photograph. And it's that visual language.
Yeah, no, I've always
not
said
thinking
to people,
about it.
right? Always carry a camera with you, right? Always, whether it's your phone or
Absolutely.
whatever. Don't hesitate to take the shot. Go take it. Go, because you might reference it later on, like that. So
yeah, and figure out what that is. I mean, carry a point and shoot, man. Even if you go, nobody makes them anymore. But find something small that fits in your pocket, or use your phone. It's fine, But shoot. I mean, that's the thing. You got to be making photographs. When I found that when I'm trying to shoot and I haven't shot anything, and like sometimes life gets in the way and you haven't photographed anything in a couple weeks or a month or whatever, and I found that I'm rusty. My blade is not sharpened at that point. And I'm struggling a little bit, especially when you're using a camera like a Leica or something, and you're trying to use a rangefinder, and it's but any camera. I mean, I would even argue that some of the newer things, the Sonys, the Nikons, the whatever, they become so advanced that you need to be in the right autofocus mode, or you need to, it's you got to stay fresh and you got to stay sharp. But find, the question I was answering earlier, and I can't remember who asked it, but find things that are inspiring to you. That's important.
yeah, well, this little blurb caught my eye. It says, photography is a visual language, a universal and powerful language. Every photograph communicates something to the viewer. And I think that's what your book is, you can sum it up to some degree, is that you want to showcase something. I want to show an emotion. I want to show something, give somebody the feels by a photo, whether it's positive, negative, what have you, right? But I want some kind of impact with somebody. So
that's the goal.
Yeah, I can't help thank you enough for joining us tonight, Ted. This has been fantastic. This is a great book to read through. Lots of techniques, but also it's more the mental side of things when it comes to photographing, right? And the conceptual side of things, how you look at the world, how you view the world, and what you want to convey.
Dave, thank you. And seriously, this has been an honor. Ev couldn't make it tonight. We're thinking of Ev. But she said, you're in good hands with Dave. And I'm like, I know Dave well. Like, Dave and I, we have had many moments. I could tell you some funny Dave stories on flights and stuff, but
Okay, you gotta keep
I won't.
the PG-13 here.
We'll leave it that. No, I absolutely. I mean, and I think that obviously, I think a lot of our audience are very well aware of Camera Store, and the Camera Store to have in, we were saying earlier, in the Amazon and B&H world, to have an actual Camera Store that you can go into, that you can take classes with. Dave's sitting in the book nook back there, and they've got. I've been there. It's an incredible library of books, all inspiring. And it's such a cool business to be able to support. And I've known Dave and Ev a long time. We go back years. So
That's
this
fantastic.
has been an honor to talk to you, my friend.
How can people find you on the net? What's your contact?
You just Google me, Ted Forbes, and stuff will come up. The book comes up because Google's going to AI now. But I'm also on YouTube and Instagram. Those are my big outlets. So.
Fantastic. Ted, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Hopefully we can bring you back up to Stampede and we can hang out and talk to you again soon.
I'd love to come.
And I appreciate everybody joining us online tonight. Take care, and we'll talk to you soon.
See ya.